Welcome to Train Signal. This is the Installing Forefront Threat Management Gateway lesson in the Forefront Threat Management Gateway 2010 training course. We'll kickstart this lesson with a review of the lab setup that will be used for the Global Mantics examples in this course, starting with this lesson in which we're going to install Forefront Threat Management Gateway. Before you do that, there are a couple of pre-installation steps you need to take, and then we're going to move on to the surprisingly easy, stunningly easy installation process that Microsoft has provided for Forefront Threat Management Gateway. And I'm not being sarcastic. Microsoft has really gone out of their way to make this process, the installation process for Forefront Threat Management Gateway, extremely simplistic. By the end of the lesson, you'll learn about also the post-installation state that your Forefront Threat Management Gateway server will be in immediately after installation takes place. For its purposes, Global Mantics is going to install Forefront Threat Management Gateway onto a single server. In order to make sure that everything is in place, you'll start out with the Threat Management Gateway preparation tool, which does exactly what it sounds like. It prepares your server with all the behind-the-scenes stuff that's needed by Forefront Threat Management Gateway in order to work its magic. This includes a number of server roles from Windows Server 2008 and a bunch of other stuff that you don't even have to worry about because the installer does it all for you. By the end of this lesson, you'll have a running Threat Management Gateway system that's ready for configuration. You'll also have an understanding of the post-installation state of the Global Mantics Threat Management System. I'd like to get started with a quick review of the lab setup that we're going to use before we deploy Threat Management Gateway into this environment. Global Mantics operates with 3 networks, and the Threat Management Gateway server has 3 network adapters as a result. The first adapter is the internal network adapter, which is the 10.1.1.0 network with a 24-bit subnet mask, which means that it's a 255.255.255.0 mask. You'll notice on that network we've also got a domain controller as well as one of Global Mantics PCs, which will be protected by Threat Management Gateway. Prior to running this lesson, I've re-addressed all of the machines in the Global Mantics network to meet the specifications that you see on this slide. The domain controller has an address of 10.1.1.254, the PC 10.1.1.10, and the Threat Management Gateway server's internal network adapter's IP address is 10.1.1.1. This is also the default route, the default gateway, that the machines on the network, the internal network, will use in order to get out to the internet. And I'm going to show you the network adapter configuration in just a couple of minutes, so I'm not going to go into too much detail right here. Global Mantics also has a DMZ, or what Microsoft calls a perimeter network. Right now, Global Mantics doesn't have anything installed in their perimeter network, but they will later on, so we're going to get ready for it now. The DMZ in this case is using the 172.16.0.0 private IP address space, again with a 24-bit subnet mask. And the IP address of the network adapter in the Threat Management Gateway server that corresponds with this network is 172.16.0.1. On the external side of the house, which is really what we're after here, is to get out to the internet, we're using the 192.168.0.0 network with a 16-bit subnet mask, which is 255.255.0.0. The Threat Management Gateway server's external network adapter is addressed with 192.168.160.2. And then there's another firewall before it goes out to the internet. Bear in mind, this is my lab setup. That's why there's yet another private IP address space on the external network adapter. If the Threat Management Gateway server was truly sitting at the edge of my network, it would have a public IP address. But because it's sitting behind my own firewall in my lab, it has a private IP address, and then everything will get routed out through that address space to the internet. It'll be pretty transparent to the Threat Management Gateway server, but I wanted to make sure that you saw that in this slide so that you would understand why the external network adapter has a private IP address. And as I mentioned, the Threat Management Gateway server has 3 network adapters defined. In my case, these are virtual network adapters because I'm running the entire lab on a Hyper-V server. On that Hyper-V server, I've defined 3 networks, an internal, a DMZ, and an external network, as was discussed in the lab setup lesson earlier in this course. Make sure you go back and review that lab setup lesson for detailed instructions on creating all of the virtual networks that you need in your own lab environment. I like naming network adapters, particularly on servers that have multiple network adapters. Therefore, I've actually named each adapter in my lab threat management gateway machine in a way that corresponds with the role of that adapter: internal, external, and DMZ. If you're following along at home, make sure that before you continue, all of the machines on your internal network can still communicate with one another, particularly if you're using a virtual environment to create all of this stuff. And make sure that you also disable the Windows firewalls on all of the internal machines. Now, in a production environment, I may not make that recommendation, but for the purposes of learning Threat Management Gateway, we don't want other firewalls to get in the way of what we're trying to do. Before you get started with a Threat Management Gateway installation, there's a couple of things that you should do. The first one we're actually not going to do here because I've already done it, but that's to run Windows Update to make sure that the Threat Management Gateway server has absolutely all of the latest possible patches that there could be. Bear in mind that the intent for Threat Management Gateway is to sit on the very edge of your network. There was a period of time when placing a Windows server at the edge of the network without a hardware firewall in place in front of it would have been considered blasphemy. Today, that's possible with Threat Management Gateway, but you still don't want to take risks, so make sure that you keep that machine patched, and that starts with making sure that your Windows updates are run before you proceed with the installation process. Next, you need to run through the preparation tool, which we're going to do in just a second. During this process, you'll be asked what kind of installation type you plan to perform. A Forefront TMG services and management tools, which is basically installing everything to a single server. Are you going to install the management tools only, or are you planning on creating an enterprise management server, which is used for larger environments? The preparation tool behind the scenes adds all of the necessary roles and services that you need in order to make the Threat Management Gateway system work. It installs and configures all of these services. Honestly, it's a truly wonderful thing. Now, let's go over to the Global Mantic's Threat Management Gateway server and take a look at the network adapter configuration and run through the preparation tool so that you can see exactly how it works and what it does. And you can see that we are indeed on the Threat Management Gateway server, TMG. This is a Hyper-V based virtual machine, and you can see that I've got 3 network adapters defined on this virtual machine. We've got the DMZ, the external network, and the internal network, which is identified as globalmantics.com by virtue of the fact that the domain controller sits out there. I'll start with the internal network because that's the one where everything's happened so far for Global Mantics, and I'll take a look at the network adapter status so we can see exactly what this thing is set up like. Again, as I mentioned before, the IP address is 10.1.1.1, and here's the subnet mask that we saw before, and it's a pretty typical configuration. The external network, 192.168.0.1 is the default gateway, and the IP address is 192.168.160.2. One of the things that you're going to notice is that this is the only adapter that actually has a default route. All of the other routing will happen through Threat Management Gateway and because of the directly connected networks. Global Mantics has a relatively simple network layout. They have a single internal network and a single DMZ. So Threat Management Gateway knows about those networks, so it will route traffic appropriately. Anything that doesn't those networks will route traffic appropriately, so will be sent out to the internet by virtue of this default gateway entry. And on the DMZ, you'll see something similar. There is no default gateway. And you may have noticed that there's no DNS server for either the external or the DMZ entries either. But for the internal network, there is. Microsoft does recommend that you have only a DNS server specified on one network adapter in your Threat Management Gateway system, generally your internal network. And that's what we've got here. So just a quick recap, we've got the DNS entry identified on the internal network adapter, and we've got the default route for the Threat Management Gateway server defined on the external network adapter, because that's the network adapter that's connected to the internet, which is really the destination network for a lot of our traffic. Now, let's run the Threat Management Gateway installer. You're going to see that there's 3 programs that are downloaded and saved right here in this folder. The first one is the Threat Management Gateway software installer itself. The other 2 are Service Pack 1 and Service Pack 1 Update 1. So we'll start with Threat Management Gateway, and we'll double click it to start the installation. You have to start the installation in order to run the prerequisite check in order to have, I blew that. You have to run this installation program in order to have the preparation tool option come up for you. And it takes it just a second to come up. So here we go. I'll click the Run button. And we'll run through the screens. This is just going to say what location do you want to store the installation files in. Now I've already run Windows Update, so we're going to skip that. But here I'm going to run the preparation tool that I've discussed before. So I'll click Run Preparation Tool. And you're going to see that there's an opening screen that tells you that it's going to make sure that all of the features that are required by TMG are installed and configured on the computer. It can take quite some time for this to run. Just be aware of that. So I'll click Next. You have to accept the license terms. And notice that there's two sets of license terms, one for .NET chart controls and another one for Microsoft Windows Installer. So just if you feel like falling asleep, go ahead and read the license agreement. We have to tell the preparation tool what kind of installation we plan on doing. That way it can install the appropriate prerequisites. So we're going to do a full installation of TMG and the management tools. So I'll choose the first option and click Next. This part takes quite a while. Remember, TMG is out in the background doing a whole lot of stuff right now. It's installing Windows roles and features and configuring everything for use by the TMG installer. So it's at this point that I'm going to pause the video, and we're going to come back right at the point at which this gets done, and we'll move on with the rest of the lesson. And we are back, and you can see that we get a successful completion message. All of the prerequisite features are installed and configured. All of the roles and features that TMG needs are ready to go, so we can move on with the installation. I'm ready to go. Let this checkbox for just a minute, and I'm going to click Finish, and we're going to go back to the slides, and we'll do the installation in just a minute. Now we're on to the real bread and butter, installing Forefront Threat Management Gateway, and we're going to kick off the Threat Management Gateway installation in just a minute for Global Mantics. During the installation, you have very little to do. You have to choose the installation path, choose that network adapter that's going to be the internal network adapter, or define an internal IP address range for Threat Management Gateway so it knows which machines are going to be the internal protected machines. And then you wait. Everything else happens automatically. There's not a whole lot to do with the installation. Like I said, this is really one of Microsoft's easiest to install pieces of software, and it's really impressive what they've done. As soon as the installation is complete, there's a couple of other things you need to do. First, you should install Forefront Threat Management Gateway 2010 Service Pack 1. We've previously discussed what's included in that service pack, and there's quite a few additional features and a lot of fixes. In the fall of 2010, Microsoft also released Forefront Threat Management Gateway 2010 Service Pack 1 Update 1. That also includes a few new features and includes some fixes that you need to worry about because they're important for a fully protected firewall. Beyond that, Microsoft has also released a number of what are called update rollups. These are basically hot fixes that are applied as Microsoft discovers potential issues with the product. Most of Microsoft's enterprise-level products, this includes Exchange and what have you, have these update rollups, SQL Server, Forefront, Threat Management Gateway. Now, the one thing you have to keep in mind with regard to Forefront Threat Management Gateway and update rollups is that they're not cumulative. Therefore, you have to install Update Rollup 1, then Update Rollup 2, then Update Rollup 3, then Update Rollup 4, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go through the process of installing the update rollups in this course, at least not on the screen, but I will go through the process of installing Service Pack 1 and Service Pack 1 Update 1. But I wanted to make you aware of the update rollups issue because it's an important one when it comes to implementing Threat Management Gateway into a production environment and keeping the organization well protected from outside threats. Now, without further ado, let's go back over to the Global Mantics Threat Management Gateway server and kick off the installation, and then SP1 and then Update 1. And we're back here at the splash screen that we saw before, and this time we'll choose to run the installation wizard. So we'll tap that, and we'll get started. And you can see that it's going to take about 19 or so minutes for everything to install once we get everything kicked off. On this first page, you can simply click Next. It's just a warning page about copyrights and all that good stuff. Then we have the license agreement. Again, if you'd like to, you can read the license agreement, but I'm not going to read it to you for the course. So we'll click Next again. We will make sure we register the software appropriately. And click Next. If you have a serial number, enter it. And we're going to install Threat Management Gateway Services and Management. We're not going to do the other options for this particular installation. So I'll click the Next button again. For Global Mantic, the default installation path is absolutely perfect. So we're going to keep that at /program files Microsoft Forefront Threat Management Gateway. If you want to, you can change that installation path by clicking the Change button and choosing a new one. Now we've got to tell the installer which network adapter is the internal network adapter, or give it an IP address range. So we'll click the Add button, and we're going to choose to add an adapter. And I've named them, so we can choose the internal network adapter, and you're going to see that there's some information down here. It's going to tell us what kind of adapter it is, the IP address that it has, and the route information, basically what IP addresses are available out of that network adapter. So we'll click OK. We can click the Change button if we made a mistake, but here we see that the internal network adapter is 10.1.1.0 through 10.1.1 at 255, and click Next again. And you're going to be given a warning that some services are going to restart during the installation. Because this is a brand new server, it doesn't really matter. Nobody's using it yet, so I don't care if these services restart. Now the fun starts by clicking the Install button, and this is where we play the waiting game. Once I click the Install button, which I'll do right now, it's going to take 15 or 20 minutes or more for all of the components to fully install. So as we did before, I'm going to pause the lesson, and we'll come back when the installation is complete. I hate to deprive you of a status bar, but we'll do it for the greater good. Like we always like to see, we had a successful completion of the installation of this product. So Forefront Threat Management Gateway is now installed for Global Mantic. So I'll click the Finish button. I'm not going to launch the Forefront Management Console yet. We'll be doing that in the next lesson because now we're going to install Service Pack 1 and update Rollup 1. So we'll start by installing Service Pack 1. I'll just simply double click the installer. Here we'll click the Open button to move on with the process. And this is going to kick off the installer for us. We start with a splash page or an opening page for the installation, so I'll simply click Next. We'll accept the terms of the license agreement and click Next again. We now have to decide which system is the configuration storage server. Well, we just installed Forefront Threat Management Gateway, so we're going to point to that as the Threat Management Gateway or the configuration storage server, and then we'll choose Connect using the credentials of the logged on user. I'm logged in as an administrator, which will have full rights to the Threat Management Gateway system. And then we'll click Install to install Service Pack 1, and this process will take just a couple of minutes. And the process is complete. So simply click the Finish button to exit the installation. Now we'll install Update 1. By the way, when you download these files, you will not see the SP1 or the SP1U1. I simply added those to the file name to make sure that I actually clicked the right one at the right time and did them in the right order. So I did that for myself. You will not see the SP1 or the SP1U1. They'll stop at the ENU. So click Run, and we're going to run through a similar process here. So on the home page of the installer, we'll simply click Next. We will accept the license agreement. And once again, we'll just use our current credentials because we're logged in as an administrative user. We'll click Install, and then once again, we're simply going to wait for this installation process to complete. You've probably noticed by now that the installation process for Threat Management Gateway is a lot of click, click, wait, click, click, wait. There's very little that you actually have to think about, which in a way is kind of nice. Not always great, but it's kind of nice that you don't have to worry about too much, because with so many software packages, you already have to worry about a lot of different prerequisite things and things you've got to do ahead of time to make absolutely certain you've got all the pieces in place. And that's it. So we'll click Finish again. We can close this window now, and we can also exit the overall installer. At this point, in this post-installation state, before we've done any configuration, Threat Management Gateway is in a fully locked down state. Nothing's going to work. No traffic's going to traverse the firewall at all until you run some configuration wizards, which we'll do in the next lesson. After those are run, there's only one rule in place, which is a deny all traffic. No traffic is allowed to traverse the Threat Management Gateway system. This is good security. You don't want to have things wide open and then have to close things down individually. You want to start in this kind of scenario with a fully locked down system and then pick and choose what to open. That's the way you have to handle security, particularly at the edge of the network. We kicked this lesson off with a couple of reviews about the lab setup to make sure that you were well prepared to kick off the installation for Forefront Threat Management Gateway. We then went over some pre-installation steps that you need to take, and then we went through the installation of Forefront Threat Management Gateway 2010 along with Service Pack 1 and Update 1. We then briefly discussed what Threat Management Gateway looks like at the very end of the process. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.